Should the Toronto Raptors make a trade for Andre Drummond? This is one of the underlying questions that's been debated since the news broke that from Sean Sarania that the Toronto Raptors are interested in acquiring a guy like Andre Drummond and are in active trade talks to try and get him onto their roster. And this is not a surprise. We know that their defensive rebounding and center position has become significantly depleted after losing Serge Ibaka and Marc Gasol. So when you see the biggest trade asset going into the trade deadline being technically Andre Drummond, one of the bigger names in the trade market, obviously a center and arguably the best rebounder in the NBA, it makes sense to link the two teams together. Toronto's a team that's still kind of in the middle of, are we a win now kind of team, or are we a building to the future kind of team? And they haven't really decided that. And I think Masai Ujiri and the front office still aren't really certain about the direction that this team is going. The fact that they're interested in a guy like Andre Drummond kind of tells me they do want to win now. However, I'm here to tell you that it's a bad idea. And despite the fact that I like him, there's one big reason that overshadows everything. And the reason is that you're going to have to overpay to get him. And what I mean by that is he makes $28 million. And the way the cap works, you have to make up 80% of that money when making a trade because they're over the cap. And as a result, Toronto has to give up, to make the money work alone, you have to either give up Kyle Lowry, which then defeats the purpose because you're trying to win now and you get rid of one of your best players, your franchise guy, kind of the heart and soul of the team, to get back Andre Drummond, and you're just lowering your ceiling when you do that move. And then secondly, the only other trade you can do involves massively depleting your depth by giving up Norman Powell, who's arguably as good a player as Andre Drummond, and we'll talk about the statistical oversight of the way he plays in terms of he has all these stats, he shows all these numbers, but there's not a lot of credibility to those numbers being valuable. And I think a guy like Norman Powell brings more value to a team because he contributes more to winning, but that's a whole different discussion. For the sake of this argument, let's assume that Andre Drummond is a better player than Norman Powell because that's a fair thing to say. That's a very, very reasonable thing to say. And so under that assumption, you have to give up him, Aaron Baines, Patrick McCaw, and then Matt Thomas. That bills out just enough money to get you to 80% of $27x million that Andre Drummond makes. So now you've put together the cap. You maybe attach a second round pick because that's sort of what his value is around the league. You might not even have to, but you're giving up these 4 players to then get back 1. That's not a terrible thing. It's not completely unrealistic. Toronto is going to be giving up some guys to get back a really solid center, and then you keep together this core of Kyle Lowry, Fred VanVleet, OG Anunoby, Pascal Siakam, and then Andre Drummond starting at the center position, which is a really solid starting 5. And then off the bench, you've got a guy like Chris Boucher, a guy like Terrence Davis as well, as a couple of players who can help Toronto take it to that next level. I still think you're missing a bit of that bench depth. You know, DeAndre Bembry is great. Stanley Johnson is good. Yuta Watanabe is good. But when push comes to shove and you need an 8-guy rotation for the playoffs, I don't know if any of those guys are really going to be able to contribute enough minutes to support your team. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they will. And I know Chris Boucher will be a playoff guy that will get minutes and will deserve some reps. But other than that, some of these guys are young, inexperienced, and it's not a bad thing. But when you're trying to win now, you might need to add another piece to add to your bench. That's where a move for a guy like Vucevic and potentially adding a guy like T. Ross to the mix could be beneficial if you're trying to make a similar move. However, that's another discussion in terms of what they'd want, the money that they make, and all the other stuff that you have to work from a management perspective to get that trade to happen. But we're here to roast Andre Drummond, one of the elite rebounders in the entire NBA. No question about that. In terms of defensive rebounding percentage, he leads the entire NBA. In terms of rebounds per game, he is a monster on the glass, averaging 13.5 rebounds per game, not currently leading the league, averaging 17.5 points, And then the stats that really get people interested is that he gets 1.2 blocks, 1.6 steals. He's almost like a 3 stock, which is steals and blocks combined, player per game, which is pretty impressive for a center. But these stats don't come with, the stats that are, the sort of the things that make him a negative player, which are some of the advanced stats when you look at true shooting percentage for a center, and him being one of the worst in the NBA in terms of shooting 50% true shooting as a big man. And in terms of regular field goal percentage on the 2020-2021 season, he's shooting 47%, which is not good for a center, and he takes dumb, untimely shots. He has bad shot selection, and once every game you see him make a crazy play where he dribbles it off his foot or something like that. So he's a high turnover rate kind of guy at the center position, and he's in over his head in terms of thinking who he is, right? There's a quote that goes all the way back to when he was getting drafted, and he's saying he was as good as Kevin Durant. These are the kinds of things that this guy says, and he's got this ego that is a little concerning. And he hasn't been able to prove it on the court in terms of production for a championship team. He's only ever been on the best team he was on were the Pistons when they got swept in the first round by the Milwaukee Bucks as the 8th seed. And it's unfortunate because, the blame gets pushed to him, but at the same time, the team wasn't built properly. But I still don't believe in the numbers to say he's, a championship caliber guy, but maybe if he's put into that situation, he can improve. That's one thing we don't know. However, the one thing that really makes me want to stay away from him isn't necessarily all these negatives I've been talking about on the court. It's just what you'd have to give up versus what his value is. At $28 million, there's no realistic way that Toronto can squeeze the cap without having to give up more than they should. You'd rather keep a guy like Norman Powell, attach a pick to a couple players, and then get him back in return. In my mind, you're more likely to go with a guy like JaVale McGee, who's also on the Cavaliers, who makes less money and is easier to acquire by attaching a second-round pick to a guy like Aaron Baines, and you get JaVale in return, and he can be a guy that can contribute. He won't be as good as Andre Drummond, but you're going to get a guy who's a little more polished in terms of being in a system for a championship contending team, or a team that wants to compete in the playoffs, and that's what Toronto wants to do. JaVale McGee's done that, right? He's won a title with the Golden State Warriors. He's proven that he can be that kind of guy. The question is, can Andre Drummond develop into that player? That's kind of what you're risking when you make a trade for him. The other big thing is that he's an unrestricted free agent after this season, so you could end up making this trade, he could walk, and you could end up with nothing again and having still that issue at the center position. Maybe you're more likely to go with a guy like John Collins, who's a lot younger. He's a restricted free agent, so you could end up giving him a big contract in the offseason and just bet on his progression. However, he's kind of an undersized 5. He's more of a 4 in the modern NBA as well, which can be an issue. The thing with Andre Drummond that we have to remember is he worth what you're going to have to give up? And as a Raptors fan, you have to discuss that to yourself. You have to figure it out, chat with your friends, and decide if he's worth Norman Powell, Aaron Baines, Patrick McCaw, Matt Thomas. Like, maybe he is to you, but it's important to remember that there are nuances to his game that you don't see as a Raptors fan because you don't watch all of these Cleveland Cavalier games. And he has these nuances that are just very, very bad habits in his game, including being a bit of a locker room cancer, being a bit of a guy that makes dumb plays. He wants the ball in the post. He wants to shoot 20 shots a game. But then, contrarily, you'll get a guy who's going to clean the glass on the offensive boards and on the defensive boards, and a guy who can hang with Embiid. You get a decent rebounder. In the pick and roll, obviously, you always struggle with the big man, but traditional guy who has his offensive limitations in terms of shooting the ball. He hasn't hit a 3 this season. He basically has never really hit one in his career, realistically. So he's not a guy that's going to be providing the outside jumper. He's going to be a guy you put in the pick and roll. He wants to get touches down low and posting up against smaller guys. He wants to clean the glass and get 20 rebounds, and that's amazing for Toronto, but is that worth the price of what you're going to have to give up, which is, like I said, either Kyle Lowry in a 3-team deal that maybe brings back some other young guys, but then, like I said, that kind of backtracks your entire process of trying to compete, unless you think he's the future center for the Raptors, which is a whole nother story. Or you make a trade. Like I said, you have to include Powell's $14 million that he's making, or sorry, the $10 million that he's making, as well as Baines' $7 million to help make up the majority of the money that we have to put to get him back. So you can't do a trade without giving up Powell and Baines, Patrick McCaw, and then either Matt Thomas or Terrence Davis or Stanley Johnson, one other guy to make up the cap.